According to Kwame Anthony Appiah, a cosmopolitan is a person who has obligations to others, obligations that stretch beyond those to whom we are related, and take seriously the value not just of human life, but of particular human lives, which means taking part in the practices and beliefs that lend them significance. There are many characters over the course of Western literature that provide both examples and profound non-examples of cosmopolitans. After considering many important characters, I settled on an understated and underappreciated cosmopolitan, Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre. Jane Eyre spent an early childhood in the care of a cruel aunt who allows her cousins to tease and scare her. Finally, tired of caring for Jane, cruel Mrs. Reed sends Jane to boarding school. It is in this setting that we first glimpse Jane's cosmopolitanism. When a scourge of typhus grips the all-girls school, Jane's close friend Helen becomes deathly ill. Jane visits her in her last hours, and Helen explains to Jane that she is going to heaven to meet God. Jane, completely unaware of the tenets of Christian faith, is surprised at first, but then instinctively comforts Helen by seeking to understand Helen's faith. "You are sure then, Helen, that there is such a place as heaven, and that our souls can get to it when we die?" Helen responds, "I am sure there is a future state. I believe God is good. I can resign my moral part to him without any misgiving." Jane says, hopefully, "And I shall see you again, Helen, when I die?" Helen reassures her, "You will come to the same region of happiness, be received by the same mighty universal parent, no doubt, dear Jane." After this exchange, Jane, even as a child, realizes that further questioning will not serve to comfort her friend. She narrates to the reader, "Again, I questioned, but this time only in thought. Where is that region? Does it exist?" Jane's theological exchange with Helen is indicative of her cosmopolitanism because, as Appiah states, an aspect of cosmopolitanism is what philosophers call fallibilism, the sense that our knowledge is imperfect, provisional, subject to revision in the face of new evidence. Not only does Jane respect and value Helen's beliefs, but her devotion to Helen, coupled with her openness to the values of others, prompts her to consider the possibility of a heaven and a benevolent God. Just as cosmopolitans believe in obligations to others, so does Jane. Despite the unfortunate childhood she experienced in the boarding school, she spends her early adulthood as a teacher in that same boarding school out of an obligation to enrich and better the lives of the girls who attend. Jane, in the vein of cosmopolitanism, does this for people to whom she has no relation or shared creed. In her next stage of life, serving as a governess in the home of wealthy Mr. Rochester, Jane demonstrates the cosmopolitan belief that there are shared moralities. Mr. Rochester falls in love with Jane and they plan a wedding. Shortly thereafter, there is an incident in which Jane perceives an apparition that tears her wedding veil in half. Mr. Rochester attempts to lie away the incidents, despite the actual torn wedding veil, but later is forced to reveal his horrible secret. His insane wife has been housed in the attic for many years, unable to be divorced from him. Jane is presented with a complex moral issue that she must view through her ingrained cosmopolitanism. In one sense, Mr. Rochester is fulfilling a moral duty to his wife by caring for her basic needs. In another sense, he would be committing adultery by being in a relationship with Jane. Jane views the situation through one of Appiah's attributes of cosmopolitanism. You do not have to share a value to understand why it motivates someone else. Jane demonstrates complete understanding of why Mr. Rochester feels comfortable marrying her while still keeping his wife in the attic. She is insane and unable to meet the obligations of being a wife, plus he is in love with Jane. When Mr. Rochester begs Jane's forgiveness, she narrates, "Reader, I forgave him at the moment and on the spot. There was such deep remorse in his eyes, such true pity in his tone. I forgave him all, yet not in words, not outwardly, but at my heart's core." The distinction that Jane makes between an outward expression of forgiveness and one that is in her heart indicates that she can see why Mr. Rochester could morally justify his actions while knowing that they are intolerable for herself. Jane makes a decision to leave Mr. Rochester and never return. However, after an eventful interim, Jane does return. She discovers that Mr. Rochester's home has been burned to the ground by his wife, causing her to die and him to become blind. Jane comes to the realization that her desires have lined up with her morals. She is now free to be with Mr. Rochester. This weighty conclusion to Jane's personal account of her life lines up with Appiah's sense that being cosmopolitan means understanding that morals do not always reconcile with desires. Jane's fidelity to her own morals and beliefs, while being able to empathize completely with the moral frameworks of others to create a shared understanding, is what guides her in her life of serving others with no relation to herself and ascribing significance to their practices, a true cosmopolitan.